I need to give you some context before we go any further, because this place, Black Hollow, it's got a reputation that goes back further than the Park Service, further than the Forest Reserve designation in 1923, all the way back to when the Shawnee people lived on this land. They called it something else back then, a name that roughly translates to where the hunger walks, or the hollow place. Local folklore talks about something called the Hollow Man, this gaunt figure that appears in the woods before people vanish. I'm talking century-old stories, passed down through generations, the kind of thing you'd hear around campfires to scare kids into staying close to camp. Growing up in these mountains, I heard those stories plenty, never believed them. Still trying not to believe them, if I'm being honest. Evan Hart is 32, been a ranger here for 6 years, the kind of guy who actually gives a damn about the job beyond collecting a paycheck. Smart, careful, knows these trails better than most people know their own neighborhoods. 2 days ago, he was doing a routine patrol on Ridgeway Trail, Sector 8, about 11 miles northeast of park headquarters. His last radio check-in came through at 4:47 in the afternoon, and I've listened to this recording about 40 times now. There's something underneath that noise. Sounds like branches breaking, heavy branches, the kind that don't snap unless something with serious weight moves through them. And then just for maybe 2 seconds before the transmission dies completely, there's this sound that I can't quite describe. It's like a voice, human but wrong, like someone trying to mimic human speech, but not quite getting the pitch right. Makes your skin crawl. Superintendent Karen Whitfield called me into her office 3 hours after Evan missed his evening check-in. She's been running Black Hollow for 8 years, efficient to the point of being cold, and she made it very clear this needs to be handled quietly. Tourist season starts in less than 3 weeks. We've got a federal funding review coming up, and the last thing the park needs is media coverage about a missing ranger. She didn't say it directly, but the message was obvious. Find Evan fast, keep it contained, make it look routine. I walked out of that office feeling sick, because when someone tells you to keep a missing person quiet, they're already assuming the worst. I partnered up with Ranger Laura Mitchell for the search. She's 28, been here 4 years, and she knew Evan better than most of us. We geared up and headed out to mile marker 7, just as the sun was dropping behind the ridgeline. Temperature was falling fast, down to maybe 38 degrees, and the forest had this stillness to it that felt off. I've spent 2 decades in these woods, and I know what normal sounds like. Birds settling in for the night, wind moving through the canopy, the occasional rustle of deer or raccoons. This was different. This was silence, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing. Laura noticed it too. She kept looking over her shoulder, hand resting on her radio like it was a lifeline. We reached mile marker 7 around 7:15, used our flashlights to scan the immediate area. Found Evan's ranger hat first, snagged on a low branch about 15 feet off the main trail. The fabric was torn, not weather damage, but like it had been ripped off his head during movement. Then we found the boot prints. Evan's work boots, size 11, standard park issue, but they weren't the careful, measured steps of someone on patrol. These prints showed someone running hard, digging into the soft earth with enough force to leave deep impressions. The spacing between steps was long, desperate. He was sprinting through these woods in near darkness, which tells you everything about how scared he must have been. Laura's light caught something carved into a pine tree about 20 feet from where the boot prints started. Numbers scratched into the bark, deep enough to still be weeping sap. 11-94, November 1994. I felt my stomach drop because I know that date. Every ranger who's been here more than a few years knows that date. That's when Robert Caldwell died. He was a fire spotter stationed at Tower Number 7, the old fire watch station about 3 miles north of where we were standing. Official report says he fell from the tower stairs after drinking on duty. Accidental death, case closed. But there were always rumors, whispers that it wasn't an accident, that something else happened up there. The investigation got shut down fast, pushed through by Park administration, and Caldwell's family never got real answers. I radioed back to base, reported what we'd found, requested additional search personnel for first light. That's when Laura grabbed my arm, pointed her flashlight at the ground near the tree. There were other tracks, and these weren't human. At first I thought maybe elk. We've got a decent population in the northern sectors, but the size was all wrong. These prints were massive, easily 18 to 20 inches long, shaped like human feet but wrong. 4 toes instead of 5. The stride length between prints was over 7 feet. Whatever made these tracks was tall, heavy, and moving through the forest without any sign of hesitation or difficulty navigating in darkness. Laura's voice was barely a whisper when she said Evan had been asking her about the disappearances. I asked her what disappearances, and she explained that 3 weeks ago, Evan started pulling old case files, going back decades, looking at every missing person report filed in Black Hollow since the park was established. He found a pattern. 17 people vanished in this forest between 1947 and now. All of them disappeared within a 2-mile radius of Tower Number 7. All of them between late October and early December. All of them when temperatures dropped below 45 degrees at night. The Park Service never connected them publicly, always treated each case as isolated, usually blamed exposure, animal attacks, hikers getting lost. But Evan had mapped them out, and Laura saw his research. She said he was obsessed with it, said he believed something was actively hunting in these woods. We kept searching, following Evan's tracks deeper into the forest. About a quarter mile from the trail, we found his radio, and this is the part that made my blood run cold. It wasn't dropped. It wasn't lost during a fall. Someone or something had deliberately smashed it. The casing was cracked, internal components crushed like they'd been stepped on with significant force. Next to the destroyed radio, we found Evan's backpack. Everything inside was untouched. Water bottles, emergency supplies, his phone which was dead but undamaged, even his wallet with cash still in it. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't an animal attack. Animals don't smash radios and leave food supplies intact. Laura's own radio crackled with static, and then we both heard it. Evan's voice coming through the speaker, weak and distorted, but definitely his voice saying, "Anthony, don't trust anyone at headquarters." I grabbed the radio, tried to respond, but the transmission was one way. I checked the signal indicator and felt my skin go cold. The transmission wasn't coming from outside the forest, from a vehicle or building. It was broadcasting from somewhere deep in the restricted northern sector, the area that's been closed to the public for the last 12 years due to unstable terrain and dangerous wildlife. Someone was broadcasting from inside Black Hollow itself, and they were using Evan's voice. I made a decision right there. Protocol says we wait for daylight, wait for full search teams, coordinate with county emergency services. But I've seen enough missing person cases to know the first 48 hours are critical, and we were already past that window. I told Laura we were tracking that signal, going in now, and she didn't argue. We marked our position with GPS, made sure our own radios were functioning, and started moving north into the restricted sector. The trees got denser, older, the kind of old-growth forest that makes you feel like you're walking through a cathedral made of wood and shadow. About 2 miles in, Laura stopped dead, grabbed my shoulder, and pointed ahead. There was a trail camera mounted on a tree, one of those motion-activated wildlife cameras hunters and researchers use. But this one was pointed directly at the spot where Evan's tracks led off the main trail. Someone had been watching this location, recording whatever came through here. I pulled the SD card, pocketed it, made a note of the exact coordinates. That camera wasn't Park Service equipment. It was civilian grade, expensive, the kind you'd use for serious surveillance work. Someone knew this area was significant. Someone had been monitoring it, maybe for days, maybe for weeks. The temperature dropped another few degrees as we pushed deeper. I could see my breath in the flashlight beam now, could feel the cold working through my jacket. Laura was shivering despite her gear, and I realized we were both feeling something beyond just the weather. There was a presence in these woods. I don't know how else to describe it. Like being watched by something patient, something that had all the time in the world. I've been in dangerous situations before, fought fires that could have killed me, faced down angry bears and hostile drunks. But this was different. This was primal fear, the kind that lives in the oldest parts of your brain, the parts that remember when humans were prey. We're stopping here for tonight, setting up a cold camp about 3 miles into the restricted sector. Can't risk a fire. Don't want to announce our position to whoever or whatever is out here. I'm broadcasting this on the emergency channel because I need people to know what we've found, need documentation of where we are and what we're doing. If you're listening to this, if you're part of the search coordination, or if you're just someone monitoring emergency frequencies, I need you to remember something. Black Hollow National Forest covers over 200,000 acres of wilderness. There are places in here where nobody's set foot in decades. There are valleys and caves and forgotten corners where anything could be hiding, surviving, watching. The old stories about the Hollow Man, the folklore the Shawnee passed down for generations, maybe they weren't just stories, maybe they were warnings, and maybe we should have listened. I'll broadcast again at first light when we resume tracking. Until then, stay safe out there. And if you're anywhere near Black Hollow, if you're camping or hiking in the northern sectors, get out. Get out now. Don't ask questions. Don't wait for official warnings. Just leave. Something is wrong in these woods. Something that's been wrong for a very long time, and I'm starting to think Evan found it. This is Anthony Vargas, signing off. This is Anthony Vargas, broadcasting on Emergency Channel 14.7, morning of day 2. I didn't sleep last night. Laura got maybe an hour before the cold woke her up. We're both running on coffee and adrenaline now, and I need to tell you what I found on that trail camera footage, because it changes everything I thought I knew about this situation. I spent most of the night reviewing the SD card from that surveillance camera, watching hour after hour of empty forest footage on my laptop. Mostly deer, some raccoons, one black bear that wandered through around midnight 3 days ago. Then I got to the timestamp from 2 nights ago, right around 11:30 p.m., and I had to watch it 4 times before my brain would accept what my eyes were seeing. The footage shows Evan running into frame from the left side, stumbling, clearly exhausted and terrified. He keeps looking back over his shoulder, and you can see his mouth moving like he's talking to himself or praying. Then he stops, bends over trying to catch his breath, and that's when it appears. Something moves into frame from the same direction Evan came from, and I'm going to describe this as carefully as I can because I know how it sounds. The figure is tall, maybe 7 feet or more, and so thin it looks wrong, like someone stretched a person out until the proportions stop making sense. It moves between the trees with this fluid motion that reminds me of how water flows, smooth and continuous. The night vision camera picks up its eyes reflecting back at the lens, that bright white shine you see with animals, but the face shape is too human. Skin pulled tight over bone structure, mouth that seems too wide. It's following Evan but not rushing, just maintaining distance like it knows he can't escape, like it's enjoying the chase. Evan sees it, starts running again, and that's when 3 more figures enter the frame from the right side. These ones are human, no question about it. They're wearing tactical gear, dark clothing, moving with purpose and coordination. They've got equipment, maybe tranquilizer rifles based on the shape, and they're pursuing both Evan and that creature. One of them raises a radio to his mouth, clearly communicating with someone. The footage ends there because the camera's motion sensor timer ran out, but those final frames showed me we're dealing with something way more complicated than a missing ranger. Someone is hunting in these woods, and they've been doing it with professional equipment and organization. I tried radioing headquarters this morning to report what I found, but the response I got from Superintendent Whitfield was strange. She told me to maintain radio silence unless it was an emergency, said there were communication issues and they needed to keep the channels clear. That's not standard protocol. When you've got a missing ranger and active search operations, you want constant updates, constant communication. Her telling me to go quiet feels like she's trying to keep something contained, and it makes me wonder what she knows that I don't. Laura and I started hiking toward Tower number 7 at first light, following the old access road that's been closed for years. The forest around us is still too quiet, that same unnatural silence from yesterday. We're both carrying everything we might need for defense, bear spray, flares, even though I'm not sure what good any of it would do against what I saw on that footage. About 2 hours into the hike, Laura told me something she'd been holding back. She said a month ago, Evan showed up at her cabin after his shift, looking shaken and exhausted. He told her he'd seen something near Tower number 7 that he couldn't explain, something that made him question whether he should report it or whether anyone would believe him. According to Laura, Evan described seeing a figure watching him from the tree line while he was conducting a trail maintenance check. He said it was daylight, clear weather, perfect visibility, and this thing was just standing there between 2 old pines about 100 yards away. At first, he thought it was a person, maybe a lost hiker, so he called out and started walking toward it. That's when he realized the proportions were wrong. The height was wrong, and the way it stood was wrong. He said it tilted its head at an angle that would break a human neck. Then it just stepped backward into the shadows and disappeared. Evan went to investigate the spot where it had been standing and found tracks in the soft ground, the same kind of tracks we found last night. 4 toes, massive feet, stride length that shouldn't be possible for any known animal in North America. We reached Tower number 7 around 9:30 in the morning. The structure is exactly as creepy as you'd imagine an abandoned fire lookout to be. All rusted steel beams and rotting wooden stairs leading up to an observation cabin 60 feet in the air. The fence around the base was torn down years ago, and you can see evidence of people using this place as a party spot, beer cans and spray paint tags covering the lower platform. But as we got closer, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. There were fresh boot prints in the mud around the tower entrance, multiple sets, all from within the last few days, based on how crisp the edges were. Someone had been coming here regularly, and recently. The stairs up to the observation cabin are in terrible shape, boards missing, metal corroded, but I've climbed worse during fire operations. I told Laura to stay at the base and keep watch while I went up. The climb took maybe 10 minutes, testing each step before putting my full weight on it, and the whole structure swayed in the wind enough to make my stomach turn. The observation cabin at the top is mostly gutted, windows broken out, furniture gone, floor covered in bird droppings and leaves. But in the corner, someone had been using this space recently. There was a sleeping bag, still relatively clean, cases of bottled water, boxes of military rations, the kind you can buy at surplus stores, medical supplies including bandages, antibiotics, and enough trauma equipment to run a field hospital. I found notebooks stacked on a makeshift desk made from old crates. The handwriting belonged to multiple people, entries dating back months. Most of it was observational notes about wildlife patterns, temperature recordings, moon phases, but mixed in were descriptions of sightings, encounters with what they kept referring to as the subjects. They used clinical language, detached and scientific, describing physical characteristics, behavior patterns, hunting techniques. One entry from 6 weeks ago described Subject Alpha demonstrating tool use, observed fashioning a sharp implement from a deer bone. Another entry mentioned Subject Beta showing signs of increased aggression during temperature drops below 40 degrees. These weren't random notes from paranoid hikers. This was organized research, systematic documentation of something living in Black Hollow. Then I found the photographs, and this is where my hands started shaking. Old pictures from 1994 showing a group of men standing in front of Tower Number 7. I recognized one face immediately, Robert Caldwell, the fire spotter who supposedly died here. He's standing next to 3 other men in what looks like military or government casual dress. The back of one photo had names written in faded ink: Caldwell, Daniel Foster, George Ramirez, and Charles Benson. I know Foster, he's a retired ranger who still lives in the area. Ramirez was park superintendent back in the 90s. But Benson, that name means nothing to me, and his face doesn't match anyone I've seen in park records. Underneath the photographs, I found a journal, leather-bound and water-damaged, but still readable. The first entry was dated November 3rd, 1994, written by Robert Caldwell. He describes being approached by a man named Charles Benson, who claimed to be working for a Department of Defense research initiative studying unusual wildlife in remote forests. Benson wanted to use Tower Number 7 as an observation post, said they were tracking something dangerous that had been living in Black Hollow for potentially decades. Caldwell agreed to help, started documenting sightings, and within 2 weeks he was writing about encounters that sound identical to what Evan described. Tall, emaciated figures moving through the woods, behavior that seemed intelligent but alien, evidence of tool use, and complex hunting strategies. The final entry in Caldwell's journal is dated November 17th, 1994. He writes that he's discovered something that changed his understanding of the entire situation. He doesn't say what it was, just that he needed to get the information to federal authorities immediately, that what was happening in Black Hollow was bigger and darker than wildlife research. The entry ends mid-sentence, and based on park records, Caldwell died 2 days later in his supposed fall from the tower stairs. I'm standing in the spot where he wrote those words, looking at his handwriting from 30 years ago, and I'm convinced he was murdered to keep him quiet. I radioed down to Laura to tell her what I found, but before I could finish my sentence, we both heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. It was a voice, human sounding, but with that same wrong quality from Evan's cut-off transmission. It was calling my name, Anthony, drawn out and echoing through the trees. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, bouncing off the tower structure and the surrounding forest. Laura's voice came through my radio, tight with fear, telling me she could see movement in the tree line about 50 yards north of our position. Multiple figures, staying just inside the shadow cover, watching us. I grabbed everything I could carry from the observation cabin, stuffed notebooks and photographs into my pack, and started climbing down faster than was probably safe. My knee was screaming by the time I reached the bottom, but adrenaline was doing most of the work now. Laura had her bear spray in hand, eyes locked on those trees where she'd seen movement. I looked in the same direction and caught glimpses of something pale moving between the trunks, there and then gone, like watching fish move under dark water. We both knew we needed to get out of there, but the fastest route back to park headquarters would take us directly past those trees. That's when my phone buzzed with a text message, which shouldn't have been possible because cell reception is non-existent this deep in Black Hollow. The message was from an unknown number. Drive to 47 Hemlock Road in Hilford. Daniel Foster knows everything. Come alone. They're watching headquarters. I showed Laura the text, and she pulled up the GPS coordinates for that address on her phone. It matched the location where retired Ranger Daniel Foster lives, about 40 miles outside park boundaries. Someone was directing us away from official channels, away from Whitfield and park administration, toward one of the only people who might have been there when this all started. We made it back to my truck without incident, though I kept feeling like something was pacing us just out of sight, keeping distance but maintaining awareness of our position. The drive to Hilford took an hour and 15 minutes, enough time for me to review more of Caldwell's journal and the research notes from the tower. What I'm piecing together is a story that goes back further than the 90s. References to sightings and disappearances dating to the 40s and 50s, possibly earlier. Whatever is in Black Hollow, it's been there for generations. And there have always been people who knew about it, people who studied it, and people who tried to keep it secret. Daniel Foster's house sits at the end of a gravel road, small ranch-style place with a workshop out back and about 3 acres of property. He was waiting on the porch when we pulled up, 71 years old but still solid, the kind of man who spent his life working outdoors. His face went pale when he saw what I was carrying, those notebooks and photographs from Tower Number 7. He didn't say anything, just motioned for us to come inside, locked the door behind us, and closed all the curtains before he was willing to speak. This is Anthony Vargas, day 3, and I'm broadcasting from a location that shouldn't exist. Laura and I followed Evan's GPS coordinates north through terrain that got progressively more difficult, steep ravines and loose rock that made every step feel like a gamble. We covered those 3 miles in just under 4 hours, and what we found at the end made me question everything I thought I understood about Black Hollow National Forest. There's a hidden valley here, tucked between two ridge lines, completely invisible from any official trail or aerial survey. The tree cover is so dense that even satellite imagery would miss it, and the approach is treacherous enough that nobody would stumble across it by accident. But someone built something here, and they went to considerable effort to keep it hidden. The facility is maybe a dozen prefabricated buildings arranged in a rough circle, connected by gravel paths that show recent maintenance. There are generators, satellite dishes, chain link fencing with razor wire on top, the kind of setup you'd expect from a remote research station, or maybe a mining operation. But this is federal land, protected territory, where any kind of development requires permits and environmental assessments and public comment periods. None of that happened here. This place exists completely off the books, and judging by the wear on some of the buildings, it's been here for years. We approached carefully, staying in the tree line, watching for movement or security patrols. The whole compound felt abandoned at first. No vehicles in sight, no lights, no sound of generators running. Then we noticed the surveillance cameras mounted on posts around the perimeter, professional-grade equipment with motion tracking capability. And I realized we were already being watched. A voice came over a loudspeaker, male, calm, with the kind of authority that comes from military training. He said our presence had been noted. We were trespassing on a restricted research site, and we had two options. Leave immediately and forget what we'd seen, or come inside and get answers to the questions that brought us here. Laura and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. We were 3 miles from the nearest trail, probably 6 miles from headquarters, and our radio signals were being jammed. We'd lost contact with base over an hour ago. Running wasn't really an option, and if these people knew about Evan, walking away meant abandoning him. We stepped out of the tree line with our hands visible, and a door on the nearest building opened. The man who emerged was in his late 40s, fit and weathered, wearing tactical pants and a black jacket with no identifying marks. He introduced himself as Brian Douglas, head of security for what he called the containment operation. Douglas walked us into the main building, which turned out to be part command center and part research lab. There were computer workstations running monitoring software, maps of Black Hollow with colored pins marking locations, filing cabinets that looked old enough to predate digital records. The walls were covered with photographs, some black and white and clearly decades old, others recent and high resolution. All of them showed the same subject: the creature. Dozens of images from different angles, different times of day, different seasons. Some showed it at a distance moving through trees, others were close-ups that captured details I wish I hadn't seen. The elongated limbs, the distorted facial features, the eyes that reflected light like an animal's. But what struck me most was the progression. The oldest photos showed something that still looked mostly human, maybe just unusually tall and thin. The newer images showed something that had changed, evolved, or degraded, depending on how you looked at it, into something that barely qualified as human anymore. Douglas sat us down and started talking, and what he told us over the next hour felt like falling down a hole with no bottom. Back in 1993, the Department of Defense funded a classified research program investigating reports of anomalous predators in remote wilderness areas. Black Hollow was one of several sites selected based on historical patterns of disappearances and consistent folklore about inhuman creatures. The official goal was to determine whether these reports represented undiscovered species, misidentified known animals, or something else entirely. What they found here was something else entirely. The creature, and Douglas confirmed there are multiple individuals, not just one, showed characteristics that didn't fit any known biological category. DNA analysis came back as human, but with significant mutations affecting growth hormones, metabolism, neurological function. The historical records supported this. During the winter of 1821, there was a group of settlers who got trapped in this area by early snowfall, cut off from supplies for over 4 months. When rescue parties arrived in spring, they found evidence of cannibalism and only 3 survivors, all of whom exhibited signs of severe mental and physical deterioration. Those survivors disappeared into the forest before they could be brought back to civilization. And that's when the Shawnee stories about the Hunger Walker started appearing in oral histories. The creatures aren't supernatural. They're humans who've been fundamentally altered by disease, environment, and time. Douglas explained the containment operation has been active since 1994, though it went through several iterations and funding sources over the years. After Robert Caldwell's death, which Douglas confirmed was not an accident, the program officially shut down. But a private military contractor called Whitman Security Solutions took over the operation using a combination of federal grants and private funding. Their mission is threefold: monitor the creatures to prevent them from reaching populated areas, study them to understand the disease progression, and maintain absolute secrecy to avoid public panic. Douglas claimed they're not trying to kill the creatures, just contain them, keep them in the deep forest where they can't harm anyone. But the way he said it, the hesitation in his voice, made me think there was more to the story. I asked about Evan, and Douglas's expression changed. He pulled up footage on one of the monitors, security camera recordings from multiple angles showing Evan approaching the compound 3 weeks ago. The timestamp showed late afternoon, and Evan looked determined, not scared. He walked right up to the main gate and demanded to speak with whoever was in charge. Douglas met with him, and according to the audio recording, Evan had figured out most of what was happening. He'd connected the disappearances, found evidence of the research program, tracked the funding sources, but he'd also discovered something Douglas's team didn't know. One of the creatures, a female they'd been monitoring, was exhibiting unusual behavior. She was approaching the observation posts, leaving items like stones or branches arranged in patterns, responding to radio transmissions in ways that suggested intelligence and intention beyond basic predatory instinct. Evan became obsessed with this particular individual, started referring to her as Sarah in his notes, though Douglas's team had only ever used designation numbers. Evan believed Sarah was trying to communicate that she retained enough humanity to understand she was sick, that she was suffering. He spent 2 weeks coming back to the compound, observing Sarah from a distance, documenting her behavior. Douglas's team thought he was naive, projecting human emotions onto something that was fundamentally no longer human. Then 8 days ago, Evan went into the forest alone despite warnings, got too close to the nesting area where Sarah and 2 other creatures were sheltering. The creatures reacted defensively, chased him, and during the pursuit, Evan fell into a ravine system. By the time Douglas's team reached him, he was injured and unconscious, and Sarah was standing over him, not attacking, just watching. They brought Evan back to the compound, treated his injuries, which included a severe concussion, broken ribs, and a fractured ankle. But while he was recovering, Evan accessed their secure files, copied everything to a portable drive, and disappeared one night, taking their medical supplies and Sarah's tracking data with him. That was 4 days ago. Douglas's team has been searching for him since, trying to recover him before the creatures find him again, or before he makes it to a location with cell service and uploads their files to the internet. The whole operation, 30 years of containment and research, would collapse if this information went public. Federal investigations, criminal charges, lawsuits from victims' families, not to mention the panic that would spread through every community near wilderness areas if people knew there were predatory humans living in the forests. Laura asked the question I was thinking. If they knew Evan was injured and on the run, why hadn't they found him yet? Douglas pulled up a topographical map showing the northern sector, and I saw the problem immediately. The terrain is a nightmare of caves, sinkholes, underground streams, and collapsed mining tunnels from old silver operations in the 1920s. Hundreds of places to hide, most of them unmapped and dangerous. Evan knows the forest better than anyone except maybe the creatures themselves, and if he's trying to stay hidden, he picked the right area. But the bigger concern, the thing that made Douglas look genuinely worried, was Sarah. Her tracking collar stopped transmitting 2 days ago, either damaged or deliberately removed. The other 2 creatures from her group also went dark around the same time. Douglas's theory is they're searching for Evan, possibly to finish what they started, possibly for reasons nobody understands. I asked to see their research files, the medical data on the creatures, and what Douglas showed me next is going to stay with me forever. They'd managed to capture and examine one of the creatures about 6 years ago, an older male that had been injured and weakened. The autopsy after it died in captivity revealed the full horror of what the disease does. The bones had continued growing throughout the individual's life, causing severe pain and deformity. The digestive system had adapted to process raw meat almost exclusively, but inefficiently, meaning constant hunger. The brain showed significant deterioration in areas controlling empathy and social behavior, but retention of memory and problem-solving ability. This thing remembered being human, understood what it had lost, but couldn't stop itself from becoming what it was. The psychological torture of that existence, being trapped in a body that's betraying you while your mind watches it happen, I can't imagine anything worse. Douglas told us his team found evidence that Sarah has offspring, possibly 3 juveniles between 5 and 8 years old, hidden somewhere in the deepest part of the forest. This is the 2nd generation, born from parents who were already affected by the disease, and early observations suggest they're developing even faster, showing symptoms at younger ages. The 3rd generation, if it exists, would be even more unstable. Douglas believes the creatures are dying out, that genetic damage and inbreeding mean this bloodline probably won't survive another 20 years. But 20 years is a long time, and in the meantime, there are people going missing, families destroyed, and a secret that's eating away at everyone who knows it. I made a decision right there. I told Douglas we're finding Evan, we're bringing him back safely, and then we're deciding together what happens with this information. The conspiracy, the containment, the decades of lies, it all ends when we get Evan to safety. Douglas didn't like it, but he understood we weren't asking permission. He provided us with maps of the cave systems, Sarah's last known location, and tracking equipment. Laura and I are heading into the deepest part of Black Hollow now, into a network of underground passages where something that used to be human is hunting for a man who might be the only person who ever tried to understand it. This is Anthony Vargas, and I honestly don't know if I'll make it back to broadcast again. This is Anthony Vargas, and I need to start by saying everything I told you yesterday was a lie. Not my lie. I believed what Douglas told us because it made sense, fit the evidence, explained decades of mystery with science and containment protocols. But the truth is so much worse than anything I could have imagined. And I'm sitting here in the dark with my hands still shaking because of what we found in the last 18 hours. Laura and I entered the cave system around noon yesterday, following Douglas's maps into a network of limestone passages that drop hundreds of feet below the forest floor. The air down there is cold and wet, smells like minerals and decay, and our headlamps could only push back the darkness about 20 feet in any direction. We'd been navigating tunnels for maybe 2 hours when we found the first evidence that someone had been living down here recently. Empty water bottles, protein bar wrappers, bandage packaging. Evan had definitely been through this area. We kept following the trail deeper, and the passages started showing signs of older human activity. Wooden support beams that looked like they dated back to the mining operations from the 1920s, rusted equipment, even some old tools scattered on the cave floor. Then we found a section that had been deliberately sealed off with newer construction, concrete blocks and steel reinforcement that were maybe 30 or 40 years old. Someone had gone to significant effort to close off whatever was beyond this barrier. Laura and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. This wasn't part of any mining operation. This was something else. We found a gap in the barrier where the concrete had cracked, probably from water damage or ground shift, wide enough to squeeze through if we were careful. On the other side was a metal door with a combination lock, but the door had been forced open recently, the lock mechanism broken. Evan had been here. Beyond that door was a facility that made Douglas's compound look like a field camp. This was a full underground laboratory, multiple rooms carved out of the rock and lined with concrete, equipped with examination tables, medical equipment, filing cabinets full of documents, and refrigeration units that were still running on some kind of backup power system. The walls were marked with warning symbols, biohazard indicators, and identification numbers. This was Site Nero, the place Evan had marked in his GPS, and it had been operational long before Douglas's team ever showed up in Black Hollow. The documents we found, and there were thousands of pages, told a story that made me physically ill. This wasn't a research station studying naturally occurring mutations. This was a creation facility. The program started in 1952, during the height of Cold War paranoia, when the Department of Defense was exploring every possible avenue for creating enhanced soldiers: chemical weapons, radiation exposure, psychological conditioning, and biological modification. Site Nero was designated as a testing ground for Project Hunger, an attempt to create operatives who could survive in extreme conditions with minimal supplies by altering their metabolism and digestive capabilities. The theory was based on historical accounts of people who survived starvation through cannibalism and seemed to develop unusual strength and resilience afterward. The scientists running this program thought they could replicate and control that transformation. They were spectacularly, horrifically wrong. The early test subjects were volunteers from military special operations, men who signed up thinking they were helping their country develop survival techniques. The treatments involved forced starvation, doses of compounds extracted from diseased brain tissue, and psychological programming designed to override normal human revulsion toward cannibalism. Within months, every single test subject began showing the symptoms we now see in the creatures. Uncontrolled bone growth, deteriorating mental function, increasing aggression, and an insatiable hunger that couldn't be satisfied by normal food. The scientists documented everything with clinical detachment that made me want to burn the files. They watched these men lose their humanity piece by piece and just kept recording data. By 1957, the program had produced 14 individuals who were no longer recognizably human. The military decided to terminate the project and eliminate the subjects, but during the disposal operation, 4 of them escaped into Black Hollow. Those 4 individuals are the ancestors of every creature that's been sighted in this forest over the last 70 years. The disappearances, the folklore, the terror, all of it traces back to a government program that turned soldiers into monsters and then tried to cover it up by sealing the facility and pretending it never existed. Robert Caldwell found some of these documents in 1994, started asking questions, and was killed before he could expose the truth. The containment operation Douglas runs isn't about studying naturally occurring predators. It's about managing the consequences of a military experiment that went wrong generations ago. Laura found Evan in a side chamber that had been set up as a makeshift medical bay. He was conscious, but in bad shape, fever burning through him, infection spreading from his untreated injuries. But he was also surrounded by files and photographs, everything he'd managed to copy and organize over the past weeks. He looked up at us with eyes that had seen too much and said we needed to understand about Sarah. 3 days ago, she found him in the caves, tracked him through passages where Douglas's team couldn't follow. Evan thought she was going to kill him, expected it, almost welcomed it, because the guilt of knowing what had been done to her ancestors was crushing him. But Sarah didn't attack. She stayed with him, brought him water from an underground stream, even left recently killed animals outside his shelter. She was protecting him. Evan showed us photographs he'd taken with a hidden camera. Sarah with her 3 juveniles, teaching them which plants were safe, how to move quietly through the forest, basic survival skills that proved she retained far more intelligence than anyone had acknowledged. The juveniles looked different from the older creatures we'd seen in Douglas's files. They were still obviously affected by the disease, still showing the physical deformities, but their eyes had something the adults lacked. Awareness, maybe even hope. Evan believed they represented a stabilization, that each generation adapted slightly better to their altered physiology, and given enough time they might develop into something viable. Not human anymore, but not the tortured predators their ancestors became. Something new. Then Evan told us the part that changed everything. He'd managed to communicate with Sarah using simple symbols and sounds, and she responded by drawing in the dirt, creating patterns that matched ancient Shawnee warning markers. Sarah knows what she is, understands the history, and she's been trying to warn people away from the deep forest for years. The stacked bones near Tower Number 7, the arranged branches, the territorial markers that Douglas's team thought were just animal behavior, those were deliberate messages. Stay away, danger here, we don't want to hurt you. Sarah isn't a mindless predator. She's a mother trying to protect her children while keeping humans safe from what she might become if the hunger takes over. The facility's backup power suddenly failed, plunging us into darkness except for our headlamps. and that's when we heard it. Movement in the tunnels, multiple sources, heavy footsteps echoing through the passages. Douglas's team had followed us, probably been tracking our location through our radio signals the entire time. But they weren't alone. The distinctive sound of those wrong joints moving, the breathing that was almost but not quite human, the creatures were here too. We grabbed Evan, started moving toward an emergency exit marked on the facility maps, and that's when the shooting started. Douglas's team wasn't trying to contain anymore. They were trying to eliminate. Eliminate the creatures, eliminate Evan, eliminate anyone who knew the full truth about Site Nero. Laura and I half-carried Evan through a maze of tunnels while gunfire echoed behind us. We could hear Sarah's voice, if you can call it that, this high-pitched keening sound that was part warning and part rage. She was fighting back, defending her territory, defending us maybe. We emerged from a sinkhole exit 3 miles from where we'd entered, gasping in the cold afternoon air, and Evan pressed a small drive into my hand. Everything, he said, every file, every photograph, every piece of evidence. If something happens to him, if Douglas's team catches up, we have to make sure this gets out. The world needs to know what was done here, what's still being hidden. This is Anthony Vargas, final broadcast, and I'm recording this from a hospital room in Hilford General, where Evan Hart is recovering from surgery. It's been 36 hours since we emerged from those caves. 36 hours that felt like falling through layers of reality until I wasn't sure what was real anymore. But Evan is alive, the truth is out, and the world is going to have to deal with what happened in Black Hollow, whether it wants to or not. Let me tell you how we got here, because the ending of this story is nothing like what I expected when I started broadcasting 5 days ago. We made it maybe 2 miles toward the Southern Access Road before Douglas's team caught up with us. They had vehicles, radios, numbers on their side, and we had an injured man and the weight of evidence that could destroy everything they'd spent decades protecting. Brian Douglas stepped out of the lead truck looking tired, not angry, just exhausted by the burden of secrets he'd been carrying. He asked us to hand over the drive, said we didn't understand the full picture, that releasing this information would cause panic and destroy lives. I asked him whose lives he was worried about, the families who never got answers about their missing loved ones, or the people who turned soldiers into monsters and then abandoned them in the woods. He didn't have an answer for that. What happened next, I'm still processing. Sarah emerged from the tree line behind Douglas's vehicles, moving with that unsettling fluid grace that comes from joints that bend wrong. She had her 3 juveniles with her, and they looked terrified but determined, staying close to their mother. Douglas's team raised their weapons, and I thought we were about to witness a massacre. But Sarah didn't attack. She moved between us and Douglas's men, positioning herself as a barrier, and made this sound that I can only describe as mournful. It wasn't threatening, it was pleading. She was asking them to stop, to let us go, to end this cycle of violence and secrecy. One of Douglas's contractors, younger guy named Kevin Hughes, lowered his weapon. He said he was done, couldn't do this anymore, couldn't keep pretending these were just animals that needed containment. That moment of hesitation was enough. We heard sirens approaching from the south, multiple vehicles moving fast on the access road. Turned out Laura had managed to get a message out hours earlier when we were still in the caves, used an old emergency beacon she'd been carrying. State police were responding, and behind them federal agents who'd been monitoring Black Hollow after anonymous tips about illegal research operations. Someone had been leaking information for months, building a case, and our situation was the catalyst that brought everything into the open. Douglas knew it was over. He ordered his team to stand down, and they complied with what looked like relief. These weren't evil people. They were just caught in a system that demanded silence and punished truth. The state police secured the scene, called in medical evacuation for Evan, who was barely conscious by that point. Sarah and her juveniles retreated into the forest, and I watched them go with this mixture of sadness and hope. They didn't belong in cages or research facilities, but they couldn't safely live near human populations either. Before Sarah disappeared into the trees, she looked back at me, and I swear I saw recognition in those eyes, maybe even gratitude. Then they were gone, melting into the forest like they'd never existed. The federal agents who arrived weren't FBI. They were from an oversight committee I'd never heard of, the kind of agency that investigates agencies. They'd been building a case against the Site Nero cover-up for 3 years after a whistleblower came forward with partial documentation. That whistleblower was Superintendent Karen Whitfield. I didn't see that coming. None of us did. She'd been working with federal investigators since she took over Black Hollow 8 years ago, discovered evidence of the containment operation, and instead of going public immediately, she played along while gathering evidence. Every interaction with Douglas's team, every budget approval, every decision that looked like cooperation, she was documenting all of it. Whitfield knew going public without overwhelming proof would just get the program moved to another location with better security. She needed everything, and Evan's investigation gave her the final pieces. She authorized our search, knowing it would force the situation into the open. It was calculated, cold, and it cost Evan nearly everything, but it worked. The federal agents seized Site Nero, arrested 6 members of Douglas's team, including Douglas himself, and began the process of declassifying 70 years of documents. The media coverage started within hours. Headlines about secret government experiments and creatures living in national forests. It's been chaotic, conspiracy theories mixing with legitimate journalism, and I've had to give more interviews than I can count. People want simple answers, want me to say the creatures are either victims or monsters, either human or animal. But the truth is complicated. They're victims of what was done to their ancestors, but they're also predators shaped by generations of adaptation. They retain fragments of humanity, enough to feel suffering and loss, but not enough to reintegrate into human society. Evan spent 2 days in intensive care before stabilizing. Broken ankle, 3 fractured ribs, severe infection from his injuries, and psychological trauma that's going to take years to process. But he's talking now, giving depositions to investigators, helping them understand what he learned about Sarah and her family group. The medical team examining his case found something unexpected. Samples from his infected wounds showed exposure to the same prions that affect the creatures, likely from contact with Sarah when she was caring for him. The disease is transmissible under certain conditions, and Evan is now being monitored for any signs of infection. The chances are low. His exposure was brief, and the prions need specific conditions to take hold. But he'll spend the rest of his life wondering if he's going to start showing symptoms. Sarah and the juveniles haven't been seen since that confrontation on the access road. Federal wildlife experts and containment specialists are searching the deep forest, but I hope they don't find them. Those juveniles deserve a chance to grow up without being studied or feared, and Sarah has earned the right to live out whatever time she has left in peace. The evidence suggests the disease is genetic damage that will eventually eliminate itself, each generation showing more stability but also more health complications. In another 20 or 30 years, the bloodline will probably end naturally. Until then, Black Hollow is being designated as a restricted sanctuary zone, closed to the public, monitored but not actively hunted. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better than the alternative of capture and confinement. Daniel Foster, the retired ranger who helped us in those early days, came forward with additional documentation he'd been hiding since 1994. Turns out he'd made copies of everything related to Robert Caldwell's death and kept them in a safety deposit box for 30 years, insurance in case someone tried to cover up the cover-up. His testimony corroborated everything Evan found, and prosecutors are building cases against 12 individuals who were involved in Caldwell's murder and the subsequent obstruction. Justice is slow and incomplete. Some of the people responsible are dead, others are too old or too connected to face real consequences. But at least the truth is acknowledged now. At least the families can have answers, even if those answers bring new pain. Laura Mitchell requested a transfer out of Black Hollow. She said she can't work in a place where every tree and trail reminds her of what we found, where the silence of the forest carries too much weight. I understand that completely. I've been offered a promotion, recognition for my role in exposing the conspiracy, but I turned it down. I'm staying at Black Hollow, taking over as the new head ranger, while Whitfield deals with the federal investigation. Someone needs to be here who knows the full story, who can make sure this place is protected, not just from the creatures, but from anyone who might want to exploit them, or continue the experiments in secret. I've been back to Tower number 7 twice since everything went public. The structure is being preserved as a historical site, a memorial to Robert Caldwell and everyone else who suffered because of Project Hunger. Standing up there looking out over the forest, I think about all those fire spotters over the decades who saw something moving between the trees and tried to report it, only to be told they were imagining things. I think about the Shawnee elders who warned us about this land and were dismissed as superstitious. I think about Evan risking everything to tell a story nobody wanted to hear. The truth matters, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it destroys our comfortable assumptions about the world. 2 nights ago, I was doing a perimeter check near the northern boundary when I found something that made me stop. Arranged stones in a clearing, carefully stacked in a pattern that matched the Shawnee warning symbols. Next to them, 3 sets of tracks, 1 large and 2 smaller, leading deeper into the restricted zone. Sarah was telling me she's still here, still watching, still trying to protect her children and warn humans away from danger. I left the stones undisturbed, made a note of the location, and walked away. Some boundaries need to exist, some distance needs to be maintained, not out of fear, but out of respect for lives that have already suffered too much. The anonymous letter I mentioned in my last broadcast, the one hinting at other sites like Nero, turned out to be real. Federal investigators have identified 4 other locations across the country where similar programs operated during the Cold War. Some of them were terminated cleanly, subjects accounted for, and facilities properly decommissioned. Others are still question marks, Remote areas with unexplained disappearances and persistent folklore about inhuman predators. Those investigations are ongoing, and I suspect we'll be learning more uncomfortable truths in the months ahead. The arrogance of thinking we could improve on human nature through force and chemistry, the willingness to sacrifice individuals for theoretical military advantage, those impulses didn't die with Project Hunger. Evan is being released tomorrow, and I'm driving him back to his apartment in Hilford. He's not returning to ranger work, probably never will, but he's planning to write a book about his experience. He wants people to understand that Sarah and creatures like her aren't monsters in the traditional sense. They're victims of monstrous choices made by people who never had to face the consequences. He wants readers to sit with the discomfort of knowing there are no clean answers, that sympathy and safety can both be valid responses to the same situation. I think it's going to be an important book, the kind that changes how we think about human responsibility and the limits of redemption. This will be my last broadcast on the emergency channel. The story of Evan Hart's disappearance and what we found searching for him has been told, documented, and archived. But the larger story, the one about what we're capable of doing to each other and the scars that never fully heal, that story continues. Black Hollow is quiet again, or at least it seems quiet to people who don't know how to listen. But I know Sarah is out there with her children, teaching them to survive, trying to give them a life that their ancestors were denied. I know the forest remembers everything that happened here, holds it in the rings of ancient trees and the depth of limestone caves. And I know that somewhere, in laboratories or military installations or corporate research facilities, someone is probably asking whether we could do it better this time, whether we've learned enough to succeed where Project Hunger failed. I hope we've learned that some experiments shouldn't be attempted, that some boundaries exist for reasons deeper than policy or regulation,